Chapter 11.
Augustus soon found the horse herd in a valley south of the old line camp. Call had predicted its location precisely, but had overestimated its size. A couple of horses whinnied at the sight of the riders, but didn't seem particularly disturbed. "Probably all Texas horses anyway," Augustus said. "Probably had enough of Mexico." "I've had enough of it, and I just got here," Jake said, lighting his smoke. "I never liked it down here with these chilly bellies." "Why, Jake, you should stay and make your home here," Augustus said. "That sheriff can't follow you here. Besides, think of the women." "I got a woman," Jake said. "That one back in Lonesome Dove will do me for a while." "She'll do you all right," Augustus said. "That girl's got more spunk than you have." "And what would you know about it, Gus?" Jake asked. "I don't suppose you've spent time with her, a man your age." "The older the violin, the sweeter the music," Augustus said. "You never knowed much about women." Jake didn't answer. He had forgotten how much Gus liked argument. "I guess you think all women want you to marry them and build them a house and raise 5 or 6 brats," Augustus said. "But it's my view that very few women are fools, and only a fool would pick you for a chore like that, Jake. You'll do fine for a barn dance or a cakewalk, or maybe a picnic, but house building and brat raising ain't exactly your line." Jake kept quiet. He knew that silence was the best defense once Augustus got wound up. It might take him a while to talk himself out, if left alone, but any response would just encourage him. "This ain't no 100 horses," he said after a bit. "Maybe we got the wrong herd." "No, it's right," Augustus said. "Pedro just learned not to keep all his remuda in one place. It's almost 40 horses here, and it won't satisfy Woodrow, but then practically nothing does." He had no sooner spoken than he heard 3 horses coming from the north. "If that ain't them, we're under attack," Jake said. "It's them," Augustus said. "Scout like you who's traveled in Montana ought to recognize his own men." "Gus, you'd exasperate a preacher," Jake said. "I don't know what your darn horses sound like." It was an old trick of theirs, trying to make him feel incompetent, as if a man was incompetent because he couldn't see in the dark or identify a local horse by the sound of its trot. God, you're tetchy, Jake," Augustus said, just as Call rode up. "Is this all there is, or did you trot in and run the rest off?" he asked. "Do them horses look nervous?" Augustus asked. "Darn," Call said. "Last time we was through here, there was 200 or 300 horses." "Maybe Pedro's going broke," Augustus said. "Mexicans can go broke same as Texans. What'd you do with the vaqueros?" "We didn't find none. We just found 2 Irishmen." "Irishmen?" Augustus said. "They just lost," Dietz said. "Hell, I can believe they're lost," Jake said. "On their way to Galveston," Newt said, thinking it might help clarify the situation. Augustus laughed. "I guess it ain't hard to miss Galveston if you start from Ireland," he said. "However, it takes skill to miss the darn United States entirely and hit Pedro Flores's ranch. I'd like to meet the men who can do that." "You'll get your chance," Carl said. "They don't have mounts, unless you count a mule and a donkey. I guess we better help them out of this fix." "I'm surprised they ain't naked, too," Augustus said. "I had thought some bandit would have stolen their clothes by now." "Have you counted these horses, or have you been sitting here, John?" Call said brusquely. The night was turning out to be more complicated and less profitable than he had hoped. "I assigned that chore to Dish Boget," Augustus said. "It's around 40. "Not enough," Call said. "You take 2 and go back and get the Irishman." He took his rope off his saddle and handed it to the boy. "Go catch 2 horses," he said. "You better make hackamores." Newt was so surprised by the assignment he almost dropped the rope. He had never roped a horse in the dark before, but he would have to try. He trotted off toward the horse herd, sure that they would probably stampede at the sight of him. But he had a piece of luck. 6 or 8 horses trotted over to sniff at his mount, and he easily caught one of them. As he was making his second loop and trying to lead the first horse over to P, Dish Boget trotted over without being asked and casually roped another horse. "What are we going to do, brand him?" he asked. Newt was irritated, for he would have liked to complete the assignment himself, but since it was Dish, he said nothing. "Lend him to some men we found," he said. "Irishmen." "Oh," Dish said. "I hate to lend my rope to an Irishman. I might be out a good rope." Newt solved that by putting his own rope on the second horse. He led him back to where the captain was waiting. As he did, Mr. Gus began to laugh, causing Newt to worry that he had done something improperly after all. He couldn't imagine what. Then he saw that they were looking at the horse brands. Hick on the left hips. "It just goes to show that even sinners can accomplish Christian acts," Augustus said. "Here we set out to rob a man, and now we're in a position to return valuable property to a man who's already been robbed. That's curious justice, ain't it?" "It's a wasted night, is what it is," Call said. "If it was me, I'd make the man pay a reward for the horses," Jake said. "He'd never have seen them again if it hadn't been for us." Call was silent. Of course they could not charge a man for his own horses. "That's all right, Call," Augustus said. "We'll make it up off the Irishmen. Maybe they got rich uncles, bank directors, or railroad magnates or something. They'll be so happy to see those boys alive that they're likely to make us partners." Call ignored him, trying to think of some way to salvage the trip. Though he had always been a careful planner, life on the frontier had long ago convinced him of the fragility of plans. The truth was, most plans did fail, to one degree or another, for one reason or another. He had survived as a ranger because he was quick to respond to what he had actually found, not because his planning was infallible. In the present case, he had found 2 destitute travelers and a herd of recently stolen horses. But it was still 4 hours till sunup, and he was reluctant to abandon his original ambition, which was to return with 100 Mexican horses. It was still possible if he acted decisively. "All right," he said, quickly sorting over in his head who should be assigned to do what. "These are mainly Will Barger's horses. The reason they're so gentle is because they've been run to a frazzle, and they're used to Texans besides." "I'd catch one and ride him home if I could find one that paces," Jake said. "I'm about to give out from bouncing on this old trotter you boys gave me." "Jake's used to feather pillows and Arkansas whores," Augustus said. "It's a pity he has to associate with hard old cobs like us." "You two can jabber tomorrow," Call said. "Pedro's horses have got to be somewhere, and I'd like to make a run at them before I quit. That means we have to split 3 ways. "Now leave me to split the shortest way home," Jake said, never too proud to complain. "I bounced my ass over enough of Mexico." "All right," Call said. "You and Dietz and Dish take these horses home." He would have liked to have Dietz with him, but Dietz was the only one he knew for certain could take the Wilbarger horses on a line for Lonesome Dove. Dish Boget, though said to be a good hand, was untested quality, whereas Jake was probably lost himself. "Gus, that leaves you and the Irishman," he said. "If they can ride, you ought to catch up with the horses somewhere this side of the river. Just don't stop and play no poker with them." Augustus considered the situation for a minute. "So that's your strategy, is it?" he said. "You and Newt and P get to have all the fun, and the rest of us are stuck with the chores." "Why, I was just trying to make it easy for you, Gus," Call said. "Seeing as you're the oldest and most decrepit." "See you for breakfast, then," Augustus said, taking the lead ropes from Newt. "I just hope the Irishman don't expect a buggy." With that, he galloped off, and the rest of them trotted down to where P and Dish were sitting, waiting. "P, you come with me," Call said. "And you," looking at the boy. Though it would expose Newt to more danger, he decided he wanted the boy with him. At least he wouldn't pick up bad habits, as he undoubtedly would have if he'd been sent along with Gus. "All you 3 have to do is get these horses to town by sunup," he added. "If we ain't back, give Wilbarger his." "What are you planning to do? Stay here and get married?" Jake asked. "My plans ain't set," he said. "Don't you worry about us, just keep them horses moving." He looked at Dietz when he said that. He could not formally make Dietz the leader over 2 white men, but he wanted him to know that he had the responsibility of seeing that the horses got there. Dietz said nothing, but when he trotted off to start the horses, he took the point as if it was his natural place. Dish Bogat loped around to the other point, leaving Jake to bring up the rear. Jake seemed largely uninterested in the proceedings, which was his way. "Call, you're some friend," he said. "I ain't been home a whole day and you already got me stealing horses." But he loped off after the herd and was soon out of sight. P.I. yawned and watched him go. "I swear," he said, "Jake's just like he used to be." An hour later, they found the main horse herd in a narrow valley several miles to the north. Call estimated it to be over 100 horses strong. The situation had its difficulty, the main one being that the horses were barely a mile from the Flores headquarters, and on the wrong side of it at that. It would be necessary to bring them back past the hacienda, or else take them north to the river, a considerably longer route. If Pedro Flores and his men chose to pursue, they would have a fine chance of catching them out in the open, in broad daylight, several miles from help. It would be himself and P and the boy against a small army of vaqueros. On the other hand, he didn't relish leaving the horses, now that he had found them. He was tempted just to move them right past the hacienda and hope everyone there had gone to bed drunk. "Well, we're here," he said. "Let's take them." "It's a bunch," P said. "We won't have to come back for a while." "We won't never come back," Call said. "We'll sell some and take the rest with us to Montana." Life was finally starting, Newt thought. Here he was below the border, about to run off a huge horse herd, and in a few days or weeks he would be going up the trail to a place he had barely even heard of. Most of the cowpokes who went north from Lonesome Dove just went to Kansas and thought that was far. But Montana must be twice as far. He couldn't imagine what such a place would look like. Jake had said it had buffalo and mountains, 2 things he had never seen, and snow, the hardest thing of all to imagine. He had seen ridges and hills, so he had a notion about mountains, and he had seen pictures of buffalo in papers that the stage drivers sometimes left Mr. Gus. Snow, however, was an entirely mysterious thing. Once or twice in his lifetime, there had been freezes in Lonesome Dove. He had seen thin ice on the water bucket that sat on the porch. But ice wasn't snow, which was supposed to stack up on the ground so high that people had to wade through it. He had seen pictures of people sledding over it, but still couldn't imagine what it would actually feel like to be in snow. "Well, I guess we'll just head for home," Call said. "If we wake 'em up, we wake 'em up." He looked at the boy. "You take the left point," he said. "P'll be on the right and I'll be behind. If trouble comes, it'll come from behind and I'll notice it first. If they get after us hot and heavy, we can always drop off 30 or 40 horses and hope that satisfies them." They circled the herd and quietly started it moving to the northwest, waving a rope now and then to get the horses in motion, but saying as little as possible. Newt could not help feeling a little awed about it all, since he had somehow had it in his mind that they were coming to Mexico to buy horses, not steal them. It was puzzling that such a muddy little river like the Rio Grande should make such a difference in the terms of what was lawful and what not. On the Texas side, horse stealing was a hanging crime, and many of those hung for it were Mexican cowboys who came across the river to do pretty much what they themselves were doing. The captain was known for his sternness where horse thieves were concerned, and yet here they were, running off a whole herd. Evidently, if you crossed the river to do it, it stopped being a crime and became a game. Newt didn't really feel that what they were doing was wrong. If it had been wrong, the captain wouldn't have done it. But the thought hit him that under Mexican law, what they were doing might be a hanging offense. It put a different slant on the game. In imagining what it would be like to go to Mexico, he had always supposed the main danger would come in the form of bullets, but he was no longer so sure. On the ride down, he hadn't been worried because he had a whole company around him. But once they started back, instead of having a whole company around him, he seemed to have no one. P was far across the valley, and the captain was half a mile to the rear. If a bunch of hostile vaqueros sprang up, he might not even be able to find the other 2 men. Even if he wasn't captured immediately, he could easily get lost. Lonesome Dove might be hard to locate, particularly if he was being chased. If caught, he knew he could expect no mercy. The only thing in his favor was that there didn't seem to be any trees around to hang him from. Mr. Gus had once told a story about a horse thief who had to be hung from a rafter of a barn because there were no trees. But so far as Newt could tell, there were no barns in Mexico either. The only thing he knew clearly was that he was scared. He rode for several miles feeling very apprehensive. The thought of hanging, a new thought, wouldn't leave his mind. It became so powerful at one point that he squeezed his throat with one hand to get a little notion of how it felt not to breathe. It didn't feel so bad when it was just his hand, but he knew a rope would feel a lot worse. But the miles passed and no vaqueros appeared. The horses strung out under the moonlight in a long line, trotting easily. They were well past the hacienda, and the night seemed so peaceful that Newt began to relax a little. After all, the captain and P and the others had done such things many times. It was just a night's work, and one that would soon be over. Newt wasn't tired, and as he became less scared, he began to imagine how gratifying it would be to ride into Lonesome Dove with such a large herd of horses. Everyone who saw them ride in would realize he was now a man. Even Lorena might see it if she happened to look out her window at the right time. He and the captain and P were doing an exceptional thing. Dietz would be proud of him. Even Bolivar would take notice. All went peaceful and steady, and the thin moon hung brightly in the west. It seemed to Newt that it must be one of the longest nights of the year. He kept looking to the east, hoping to see a little redness on the horizon, but the horizon was still black. He was thinking about the morning and how nice it would be to cross the river and bring the horses through town when the peaceful night suddenly went off like a bomb. They were on a long chaparral plain not far south of the river and were easing the horses around a particularly dense thicket of chaparral, prickly pear, and low mesquite when it happened. Newt had dropped off the point a little distance to allow the horses room to skirt the thicket when he heard the shots from behind. Before he had time to look around or even touch his own gun, the horse herd exploded into a dead run and began to spread out. He saw what looked like half a herd charging right at him from the rear. Some of the horses nearest him veered and went crashing into the chaparral. Then he heard P's gun sound from the other side of the thicket, and at that point lost all capacity for sorting out what was happening. When the race started, most of the herd was behind him, and the horses ahead of him were at least going in the same direction he was. But in a few seconds, once the whole mass of animals was moving at a dead run over the uncertain terrain, he suddenly noticed a stream of animals coming directly toward him from the right. The new bunch had simply cut around the chaparral thicket from the north and collided with the first herd. Before Newt even had time to consider what was happening, he was engulfed in a mass of animals, a few of which went down when the two herds ran together. Then, over the confused neighing of what seemed like hundreds of horses, he began to hear yells and curses, Mexican curses. To his shock, he saw a rider engulfed in a mass like himself. The rider was not the captain or PI. He realized then that two horse herds had run together, theirs headed for Texas, the other coming from Texas, both trying to skirt the same thicket, though from opposite directions. The realization was unhelpful, though, because the horses behind him had caught up with him and were struggling for running room. For a second, he thought of trying to force his way to the outside, but then he saw two riders already there, struggling to turn the herd. They were not succeeding, but they were not his riders either, and it struck him that being in the middle of the herd offered a certain safety, at least. It quickly became clear that their herd was much larger and was forcing the new herd to curve into its flow. Soon all the horses were running northwest, Newt still in the middle of the bunch. Once a big wild-eyed gelding nearly knocked Mouse down. Then Newt heard shots to his left and ducked, thinking the shots were meant for him. Just as he ducked, Mouse leaped a sizable chaparral bush. With his eyes toward the gunfire, Newt was unprepared for the leap and lost a stirrup and one rein, but held on to the saddle horn and kept his seat. From then on, he concentrated on riding, though he still occasionally heard shots. He kept low over his horse, an unnecessary precaution, for the running herd threw up so much dust that he could not have seen 10 feet in front of him, even if it had been daylight. He was grateful for the dust. It was choking him, but it was also keeping him from getting shot, a more important consideration. After a few miles, the horses were no longer bunched so tightly. It occurred to Newt that he ought to angle out of the herd, not just let himself be carried along like a cow chip on a river. But he didn't know what such a move might mean. Would he be required to shoot at the vaqueros if they were still there? He was almost afraid to take his pistol out of its holster for fear Mouse would jump another bush and he'd drop it. While he was running along, trying not to fall off and hoping he and the horses wouldn't suddenly go over a cut bank or pile into a deep gully of some kind, he heard a sound that was deeply reassuring. The sound of the captain's rifle, the Big Henry. Newt heard it shoot twice. It had to be the captain because he was the only man on the border who carried a Henry. Everyone else had already switched to the lighter Winchesters. The shots meant the captain was all right. They came from ahead, which was odd since the captain had been behind. But then the vaqueros had been ahead too. Somehow the captain had managed to get to the front of the run and deal with them. Newt looked back over his shoulder and saw red in the east. It was just a line of red, like somebody had drawn it with a crayon over the thick black line of land, but it meant that night was ending. He didn't know where they were, but they still had a lot of horses. The horses were well spread by then, and he eased out of the herd. Despite the red in the east, the land seemed darker than it had all night. He could see nothing and just exerted himself to keep up, hoping they were going in the right direction. It felt a little odd to be alive and unharmed after such a deep scare, and Newt kept looking east, wishing the light would hurry so he could see around him to know whether it was safe to relax. For all he knew, Mexicans with Winchesters could be 100 yards behind him. He wished the captain would shoot again. He had never been in a situation in which he felt so uncertain about everything. Squint as he could, Newt could see nothing but dark land and white dust. Of course, the sun would soon solve the problem, but what would he see when he could see? The captain and P could be 10 miles away, and he himself could be riding into Mexico with Pedro Flores's vaqueros. Then, coming over a little rise in the ground, he saw something that gave him heart. A thin silver ribbon to the northwest that could only be the river. The fading moon hung just above it. Across it, Texas was in sight, no less dark than Mexico, but there. The deep relief Newt felt at the sight of it washed away most of his fear. He even recognized the curve of the river. It was the old Comanche crossing, only a mile above Lonesome Dove. Whoever he was with had brought him home. To his dismay, the sight of such a safe, familiar place made him want to cry. It seemed to him that the night had lasted many days, days during which he had been worried every moment that he would do something wrong and make a mistake that meant he would never come back to Lonesome Dove, or else come back disgraced. Now it was over, and he was almost back, and relief seemed to run through him like warm water, some of which leaked out his eyes. It made him glad it was still dark. What would the men think if they saw him? There was so much dust on his face that when he quickly wiped away the tears of relief, his fingers rubbed off moist smears of dirt. In a few more minutes, as the herd neared the river, the darkness loosened and began to gray. The red on the eastern horizon was no longer a line, but spread upward like an opened fan. Soon Newt could see the horses moving through the first faint gray light, a lot of horses. Then, just as he thought he had brought the flood within himself under control, the darkness loosened its hold yet more, and the first sunlight streamed across the plain, filtering through the cloud of dust to touch the coats of the tired horses, most of whom had slowed to a rapid trot. Ahead, waiting on the bank of the river, was Captain Call, the Big Henry in the crook of his arm. The hell bitch was lathered with sweat, but her head was up, and she slung it restlessly as she watched the herd approach, even pointing her keen ears at Mouse for a moment. Neither the captain nor the gray mare looked in the least affected by the long night or the hard ride, yet Newt found himself so moved by the mere sight of them sitting there that he had to brush away yet another tear and smudge his dusty cheek even worse. Down the river a ways, he could see P sitting on a rangy bay they called Sardine. Of the hostile vaqueros they had met, there was no sign. There were so many questions Newt wanted to ask about what they had done and where they had been that he hardly knew where to begin. Yet, when he rode up to the captain, keeping Mouse far enough away from the hell bitch that she wouldn't try to take a bite out of him, he didn't ask any questions. They would have poured out of him if it had been Mr. Gus or Dietz or P, but since it was the captain, the questions just stayed inside. All he said, at the end of the most exciting and important night of his life, was a simple good morning. "It is a good one, ain't it?" Call said, as he watched the huge herd of horses, well over 100 of them, pour over the low banks and spread out down the river to drink. P had ridden Sardine into the water stirrup deep to keep the herd from spreading too far south. Call knew it had been rare luck, running into the 4 Mexican horse thieves and getting most of the horses they had just brought over from Texas. The Mexicans had thought that they had run into an army. Who but an army would have so many horses? And had not really stayed to make a fight, though he had to scare off one vaquero who kept trying to turn the herd. As for the boy, it was good that he had picked up a little experience and come through it all with nothing worse than a dirty face. They sat together silently as the top half of the sun shot long ribbons of light across the brown river and the drinking horses, some of whom lay down in the shallows and rolled themselves in the cooling mud. When the herd began to move in 2s and 3s up the north bank, Call touched the mare, and he and the boy moved out into the water. Call loosened his rein and let the mare drink. He was as pleased with her as he was with the catch. She was sure-footed as a cat and far from used up, though the boy's mount was so done in he would be worthless for a week. P's big bay was not much better. Call let the mare drink all she wanted before gathering his rein. Most of the horses had moved to the north bank, and the sun had finished lifting itself clear of the horizon. "Let's ease on home," he said to the boy. "I hope Wilberger's got his pockets full of money. We've got horses to sell."